Whitney Houston had one of the most powerful voices the world had ever heard. But on February 11th, 2012, that voice went silent inside a hotel room in Beverly Hills, not on a stage, not in front of thousands of fans, not under the lights where the world was used to seeing her, but alone, behind a closed door, inside the Beverly Hilton Hotel, only hours before one of the biggest nights in music. And that is the part fans still cannot forget, because Whitney Houston did not pass away in some forgotten place. She died in the same hotel where the music industry was gathering for a glamorous pre-Grammy celebration. Downstairs, celebrities were arriving, camera flashes were waiting, the red carpet was being prepared. The room was supposed to be filled with music, success, applause, and memories. But upstairs, something completely different was happening. A woman who had once stood above the world was living the final hours of her life, and by the time the world found out, it was already too late. The official cause would later be reported as accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. But the mystery fans still talk about is not only about how Whitney died, it is about what her final hours reveal. How did a global superstar, surrounded by fame, security, hotel staff, industry friends, and people who loved her, end up in such a quiet and tragic final moment? How did the woman known as The Voice become a symbol of both greatness and heartbreak? And why does her final day still feel unfinished? Before we go deeper, this story is not about attacking Whitney Houston. This is not about turning pain into gossip. This is about understanding the hidden pressure behind fame, the warning signs people ignored, and the final hours that left millions of fans asking one question. Could someone have saved her? Whitney Houston was not just a singer. She was an event. When she opened her mouth, people stopped talking. Her voice did not sound ordinary. It sounded almost impossible. Clean, powerful, emotional, and controlled in a way very few singers could ever match. She became the kind of star the world does not create often. A church girl from New Jersey became a global icon. A young woman with a gospel foundation became one of the best-selling artists in history. She crossed pop, soul, R&B, film, and culture. And for years, Whitney did not just dominate music. She defined what a perfect vocal performance could sound like. But behind the applause, another story was slowly building. A story of pressure, a story of expectations, a story of pain that fans could see in small moments, even when the world kept clapping. The strange thing about fame is that it can make a person visible to millions and still leave them completely alone. Everyone knew Whitney Houston, but very few people truly knew what she was carrying. By 2012, Whitney was no longer the same untouched superstar the world remembered from the height of her career. She had already faced public struggles. She had already been judged, mocked, defended, and analyzed. Every appearance became a conversation. Every photo became a headline. Every change in her voice, her face, her weight, or her energy became a subject for strangers. And this is where the final hours mystery begins, because when a celebrity becomes a legend, people stop seeing them as human. They see the voice, they see the image, they see the old performances, they see the awards, but they forget that behind the legend is a real person whose body gets tired, whose heart carries stress, and whose mind can break under pressure. Whitney arrived in Los Angeles before the Grammy weekend. It should have been a familiar environment for her. The Grammy atmosphere was part of her world. She had walked those spaces before. She had been celebrated in those rooms. She had stood among the most powerful people in music. But this time, something felt different. The music industry was preparing for one of its biggest nights, and Whitney was expected to be part of that world again. There was talk about appearances. There were people hoping to see her. There were memories of her greatness everywhere. But when a person has spent years being compared to their younger self, every return becomes difficult. For Whitney, every room carried two versions of her, the Whitney people remembered, and the Whitney standing in front of them now. That pressure alone can become heavy. Imagine being expected to sound like your past forever. Imagine walking into every room knowing people are not just seeing you, they are measuring you. Did she look healthy? Did she sound strong? Was she back? Was she okay? Those questions may sound like fan concern, but when millions of people ask them at once, they can become a cage. In the days before her death, reports described concern around her appearance and behavior. Some people around her noticed moments that did not feel normal, but in celebrity culture, warning signs are often explained away. People say, she is tired, she is stressed, she is emotional, she has been through a lot. And sometimes all of that is true, but sometimes those explanations hide something deeper. The final day began like a day that still had a future. Whitney Houston was staying at the Beverly Hilton. She was expected to attend Clive Davis's famous pre-Grammy party that night, an event deeply connected to her career and history. For any other artist, it would have been just another industry gathering. But for Whitney, it meant something more. Clive Davis was not just a music executive in her story. He was part of the beginning. He was connected to the rise, the discovery, the records, the moment the world first realized Whitney Houston was not ordinary. So the idea that she would attend that event carried emotional weight. It was not just a party. It was a return to the world that built her legend. But upstairs in her hotel room, time was moving towards something no one expected. And this is where the story becomes haunting. Because tragedy does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides inside normal moments. A hotel room, a bath, a quiet afternoon, a plan for the evening, people nearby, life continuing. And then suddenly, everything changes. Whitney was found unresponsive in the bathtub. Emergency help was called. Attempts were made to revive her. But the woman whose voice had filled arenas could not be brought back. She was pronounced dead that afternoon. The news spread fast. At first, people could not believe it. Whitney Houston, dead, at 48, inside the Beverly Hilton, right before the Grammys? It sounded unreal. It sounded like one of those headlines people read twice because the mind refuses to accept it the first time. Fans froze. Artists were shocked. Newsrooms broke into coverage. Social media exploded with disbelief. And inside the music industry, the celebration that was supposed to happen that night suddenly became a moment of mourning. That contrast is one reason her death still feels so mysterious. Because the setting was almost impossible to process. The same building held two worlds at once. Downstairs, cameras, celebrities' gowns, music executives, security, speeches, and tribute. Upstairs, silence, loss, unanswered questions, and the end of a life that had shaped generations. It felt like fame and loneliness had collided in the same hotel. The official findings gave the world a cause: accidental drowning, heart disease, cocaine use as a contributing factor. But official answers do not always end emotional questions. Because fans were not only asking what happened medically, they were asking why the story reached that point. Why was Whitney alone in that moment? Were there signs that people missed? Did the industry protect her, or did it keep pulling her back into pressure? Was she trying to rebuild? Was she exhausted? Was she still fighting something private that the public could never fully understand? And perhaps the hardest question: did everyone love Whitney Houston, the icon, more than they protected Whitney Houston, the person? That is the question that still follows her story. Because Whitney's final hours are not only about death, they are about the cost of being turned into a symbol. For years, Whitney was expected to represent perfection: a perfect voice, a perfect image, a perfect smile, a perfect performance. But perfection is dangerous when the world refuses to let you be human. The public loved her voice, but the public also judged her pain. People wanted comeback stories, but they did not always understand recovery. They wanted the old Whitney, but the old Whitney existed in a time before the damage. And this is one of the most emotional parts of her story. Whitney Houston gave the world beauty. But the world often returned that beauty with pressure. When she was at her peak, she was celebrated. When she struggled, she became entertainment. Talk shows discussed her, magazines analyzed her, comedians made jokes, strangers acted like they knew her life. And somewhere inside that storm, Whitney was still a daughter, a mother, a friend, a believer, and a woman trying to survive her own story. Her final hours force us to ask whether fame makes pain louder or easier to ignore. Because when someone is famous, people assume someone must be watching over them, someone must be managing everything, someone must be protecting them. But fame can create a dangerous illusion. A superstar can be surrounded by people and still have no one close enough to stop the final moment. That is what makes the Beverly Hilton scene so haunting. It was not a remote location. It was not a place where no one knew her name. It was a luxury hotel filled with people preparing for a night of music. And yet, when the final moment came, Whitney was still beyond help. That is the mystery fans cannot let go. Not a conspiracy. Not a claim that someone secretly harmed her. But a human mystery. How does a life so loud end in a silence so deep? After the news broke, the Grammy Awards had to change overnight. The show that had been planned as a celebration became a tribute. Artists who had grown up on Whitney's voice now had to perform while grieving her. The industry that had benefited from her talent now had to face the reality of her absence. And the world began replaying her life. The big notes, the movie scenes, the red carpet moments, the interviews, the laughter, the pain, the warning signs, the comeback attempts, the final appearances. Everyone was looking for clues. Because when someone iconic dies suddenly, people search backward. They watch old videos differently. They freeze moments. They study expressions. They ask if there was sadness in her eyes. They ask if a certain performance was a goodbye. They ask if the last public moments carried a message no one understood at the time. But life rarely gives clear warnings like a movie. Sometimes the signs are scattered. Sometimes people see them only after the tragedy. And sometimes, even if people see them, they do not know what to do. Whitney's story became even more painful because of what happened later to her daughter, Bobby Christina Brown. Fans saw a tragic echo that made the wound feel even deeper. A mother and daughter, both connected to heartbreaking bathtub incidents, both leaving the world far too soon. For many fans, this made Whitney's final story feel almost impossible to process. It was no longer just about one tragedy. It became a family heartbreak, a generational sadness, a reminder that fame does not shield people from pain. It can sometimes make pain more public, more complicated, and more difficult to heal. But to understand Whitney's final hours, we must also understand what she represented. Whitney Houston was hope for millions of people. She was the sound of weddings, graduations, heartbreaks, faith, and impossible dreams. Her voice was part of people's memories. When fans heard her, they did not only hear music, they remembered where they were, who they loved, what they lost, what they believed. That is why her death felt personal to people who never met her. Because Whitney was not just famous, she was emotionally connected to millions. And when someone like that dies suddenly, the grief spreads across the world. People do not just mourn the person, they mourn the part of their own life connected to that voice. That is why the final hours still matter. Because fans want the ending to make sense. They want the story of Whitney Houston to end with dignity. They want to believe someone understood her pain. They want to believe she was more than the headlines. And she was. Whitney Houston was more than the final report, more than the hotel room, more than the bathtub, more than the substances mentioned in official documents, more than the struggles people repeated. She was a once-in-a-generation artist whose gift was so powerful that people still talk about her as if she is present. But the mystery remains because the contrast is too sharp. A heavenly voice, a lonely ending, a global icon, a private final moment, a night of celebration, a room filled with silence. That contrast is what keeps the story alive. There's another detail that fans often discuss, the timing, the day before the Grammys. The same weekend, the music world was focused on legacy, performance, and awards. Whitney's death did not happen far from the industry. It happened right in the center of it, almost as if the story was forcing the music world to look at what it had lost. For decades, the industry had celebrated stars at their brightest. But Whitney's death reminded everyone what can happen when the spotlight burns too hot for too long. Behind every award show, there are human beings. Behind every hit song, there is pressure. Behind every legend, there is a body that can break. The public often sees the success, but not the cost. They see the mansion, but not the loneliness. They see the applause, but not the anxiety before the performance. They see the comeback headline, but not the private battle required to stand on stage again. Whitney's final hours became a warning, not only about addiction, not only about health, but about how easily the world can consume a person and then act shocked when that person collapses. This does not mean the public is responsible for every tragedy, but it does mean we should ask harder questions about how we treat people when they are struggling. Do we give them space to heal, or do we demand entertainment from their pain? Do we protect their dignity, or do we turn every weakness into content? Whitney Houston's life became a mirror, and what it showed was uncomfortable. It showed how much the world loved her talent, but also how quickly the world judged her humanity. That is why a respectful telling of her final hours matters. Because the easy version is simple. A star died in a bathtub. The official report gave the cause. The world moved on. But the deeper version is harder. A woman who gave everything to the world reached the end of her life during a weekend meant to celebrate music. And the people who loved her were left wondering if the signs had been there all along. One of the saddest parts is that Whitney was still trying to move forward. She was not just a memory from the past. She had projects. She had connections. She had people hoping for another chapter. And that is what makes sudden loss so brutal. It does not wait for closure. It does not wait for the perfect goodbye. It does not wait until every relationship is healed, every question answered, every dream finished. It arrives and leaves everyone else with unfinished sentences. For fans, Whitney's final hours feel like an unfinished sentence. They keep asking what she felt that day. Was she hopeful? Was she tired? Was she nervous about being seen again? Was she thinking about the evening ahead? Was she remembering the early days of her career? Was she carrying pressure no one else could see? We cannot know every private thought, and we should not pretend to know. But we can understand the emotional weight of the situation. A woman who had lived most of her adult life in the public eye was once again standing near the center of the industry that made her famous. That alone could bring memories, pressure, pride, sadness, and fear all at once. For a person already carrying health and personal struggles, that kind of pressure can be overwhelming. The tragedy is that the world often notices the storm only after it is over. After Whitney died, people suddenly spoke softly about her. They called her a legend. They remembered her greatness. They talked about her influence. They cried during tributes. But many fans noticed the painful irony. Why do some stars receive the most compassion after they are gone? Why do we wait until the final headline to remember the full human being? Whitney deserved compassion while she was alive, not only after the world lost her. That is the lesson hidden inside the final hour's mystery. It is not just about what happened in that hotel room. It is about what happened across years. Years of pressure, years of public judgment, years of expectations, years of trying to live as both a person and a product. The music industry wanted the voice. The fans wanted the legend. The media wanted the story. But Whitney needed peace. And peace is sometimes the one thing fame cannot give. As the hours passed on that day, no one outside that private space knew they were living through history. The party was still planned. The Grammy weekend was still moving. People were still preparing speeches, outfits, performances, and cameras. Then the news arrived. And suddenly, everything changed. The Beverly Hilton was no longer just a hotel. It became the place where the world lost Whitney Houston. Suite 434 became part of music history for a reason no one wanted. And the night that was supposed to honor success became a night marked by shock. This is why the story remains powerful. Because it is cinematic in the most tragic way. The timing, the location, the contrast, the unanswered emotional questions. But we must be careful with the word mystery. The mystery is not an invitation to invent false accusations. The mystery is not proof of a hidden crime. The official ruling was accidental drowning, with contributing health and substance factors. The true mystery is human. How does someone with so much light fall into so much darkness? How can a person be adored by millions and still reach a final moment alone? How many warning signs do people miss because they are too busy waiting for the next performance? And how many stars are still living this story right now, smiling for cameras while quietly falling apart? That is why Whitney Houston's final hours still matter today. Because her story is not trapped in 2012. It speaks to the present. Every time a celebrity struggles publicly, the same pattern begins. People speculate, people joke, people judge, people demand explanations. And then, if tragedy happens, everyone becomes respectful. Whitney's story asks us to reverse that. To be human before the tragedy, to care before the final headline, to remember that talent does not cancel pain. And fame does not remove loneliness. When fans revisit Whitney's final performances, they are not only looking for sadness, they are looking for the woman behind the legend. They want to protect her memory from being reduced to one afternoon. Because Whitney Houston's story did not begin in that hotel room. And it should not end there either. It began with a voice that seemed to rise from somewhere beyond ordinary talent. It grew through songs that became part of global culture. It reached millions of people who felt stronger because she sang. It survived criticism, pain, and public struggle. And even after her death, it continues. That is the part the final hours cannot erase. The tragedy explains how she left. But it does not define who she was. Still, the final question remains. If Whitney could speak to the world now, what would she want people to remember? Would she want the focus to stay on the bathtub, the report, the substances, the rumors? Or would she want people to remember the voice, the faith, the work, the fight, and the human being behind the headlines? Maybe the real hidden truth is this. Whitney Houston was not destroyed in one moment. She was slowly worn down by a world that demanded more from her than any person could safely give. And in her final hours, the world finally saw the cost. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to feel haunted by it. The Beverly Hilton will always be part of the story. The Grammy weekend will always be part of the story. The official report will always be part of the story. But none of those things are the whole story. The whole story is about a woman who gave the world a voice so unforgettable that even silence could not erase it. That is why fans still talk about her. That is why her final hours still feel mysterious, not because the official cause was unknown, but because the emotional truth still hurts. Whitney Houston had everything people think fame gives you. Money, awards, beauty, influence, recognition, a voice that changed music. But in the end, those things could not protect her from being human. And maybe that is the most painful revelation of all. Legends are not untouchable. Icons are not unbreakable. And sometimes the brightest voice in the room is the one silently asking for help. Whitney Houston's final hours remain a mystery fans cannot forget because they reveal something bigger than one celebrity tragedy. They reveal the hidden price of fame. They reveal how public love can exist beside private loneliness. They reveal how a person can be remembered by millions and still need understanding in the moments no camera sees. So when we remember Whitney, we should remember more than the ending. Remember the young woman with a voice that stunned the world. Remember the artist who made people believe emotion could be heard. Remember the mother. Remember the fighter. Remember the person behind the perfection. And remember the warning inside her story. Do not wait until someone is gone to treat their pain with respect. Because sometimes, by the time the world finally listens, the voice is already silent.